this is your time to ask questions of synthesis, of drawing things together, of interests that you don't think were addressed, that you'd like to address, or contacts, points of contact that you saw. I will sort of moderate and occasionally make a quip or something, but primarily this is your opportunity to, we purposely, I should tell you, tried not to draw connections when we chose our three speakers for today. That doesn't mean there are no connections. So we'd like to see what connections you've seen and ask us and suggest and so on. So please.
And be careful, if you don't ask questions, we might go off.
I'll start it off, and I'm really going to direct it initially to Gene, but it's a question for all of us, I think. One of the things that Gene was pointing out are the limitations that the presidency has, but also the limitations of the Congress of getting people to do difficult things. We've got energy, no one wants to increase the price of gas, so we wind up with all kinds of problems. How do we as a society attack that problem? We all act in our own interest. And just to use gasoline as a point, a case in point, it makes sense. We're paying an enormous amount for the gallon of gasoline. The cost of military affair, military operations in Iraq and sea lanes and so forth. How do we as a society educate ourselves so we can say, we got to find some way to cut our consumption of oil or gasoline?
Failure helps. I thought if you really think of what we're going through economically and actually define it for what it is, rather than what sounds good, the notion that we're out of recession already by the measure of recession, that helps. It creates space for leadership to move people forward. I think, but it takes more than leadership in context, as it's more than one person. So then how do you bring people along? Wars are really useful. A lot of change that comes with war. I guess what I'm saying is change is difficult, and incremental change is the other side of the coin. And that is where I hope we do think of it as that is a viable way of making progress on these things, rather than, since psychologically night and day seems to be so difficult, even though crisis is an opportunity for that kind of rapid change. The moving things along in the right direction, the flip side of that, though, is we think about the climate equation and all. There's an opportunity right now. We're not taking advantage of it. And you asked me a difficult question that I obviously don't have a great answer for.
One of the things that strikes me is if you, as you were suggesting, perhaps war is an opportunity to help us let's redefine war as an opportunity, but that's always sounds a little ironic. But I take your point. But the way it plays out in the United States, it seems to me anyway, and correct me if you have a different take on it, is that war is understood almost as cost-free within the United States, right? War is something that is at a distance. It's happening elsewhere. We're not living on a daily basis with the most extreme aspects of the cost of war, so therefore it doesn't seem to me to be something that is energizing the climate in the United States to say, okay, we really have to rethink some fundamental approaches to our energy life, our foreign relations life, in a way that it actually when you think of the wars that are going on in this country, that this country is conducting right now, you'd think, yeah, why wouldn't that be a catalyst for rethinking some fundamental assumptions about how we do business? But it seems, for me, it's dismaying that it doesn't seem to be happening.
So, Peter, do you think that we should reinstitute the draft? Part of the issue of the cost of war, one is, where does it take place? It doesn't take place here. But we were much aware as a nation of the cost of World War I, World War II, and perhaps also Vietnam and the Korean War, because we had a national draft and everybody was involved. Yeah. And we ended the national draft after Vietnam, and we don't call people up out of the draft anymore. And the burden of our military is now a class thing. Yeah. It's not a national thing. It takes place primarily within poorer economic classes.
Well, there's a concept that I think is a good one, and Walt has hit on this. In anthropology, there's a really important book called Imagined Communities, which many of you may have written. And the idea in Imagined Communities is that in order to, especially in the Balkans and in Southeast Asia, attempts were made to delineate countries by the colonial powers. And my interest, of course, is in this post-Soviet era that is ongoing in Central and Eastern Europe and throughout Central Asia. And those national borders were drawn and then had to be enforced, and often it was done by print media. That's one of the premises in that book, is that print media helps to establish a national identity, and so to have print media, you have to have most of the people who can read in one language and so forth. Anyway, where I'm going with this is that it's all starting to fall apart because of the internet. And so I think that, and I'm fascinated by Walt's question, because I think it goes beyond the nation, in terms of energy consumption. When I'm in Romania and Moldova, I'm stunned to find that everybody uses energy-saving light bulbs. Not because they want to save energy, but because they can't afford electricity. And I think the more that people are connecting on the internet, which I'm quite interested in, because it's going to make a big difference in the way that national borders become possibly more and more insignificant. I'm fascinated with the way that people are sort of getting more and more information about other people around the world, and they become part of communities that have very little to do with physical borders. The internet does require literacy, and it does require shared language in that sense, but it doesn't require physical proximity. And so, the energy consumption becomes hopefully more and more of a problem that's addressed globally. And I think that probably Gene has done a lot more thinking about this than I have, but I am really interested, as in human communities and how they're formed and how they think together. And we had a Romanian student live with us, and every night at 10 o'clock, she would sit on the couch in her bunny slippers and log on to the internet, and she was gone. Physically, she might have been sitting on our couch, but her whole being was somewhere else because she was communicating in Romanian language, and we couldn't even ask her a question, And so I'm fascinated in addressing these issues, and especially as we talk about things like wars that are fought with national interests in mind. I'm fascinated with the idea that these other communities exist almost in a virtual cyberspace way, that I can be connected to a person in Indonesia because we have similar musical interests, or a person in Moldova can be connected with someone in Western Canada because of this internet access. And the internet, my own children who are now mid-20s to early 30s, they even are starting to realize that the 18-year-old students that they are teaching are much more, they're in a whole different world than they have grown up in because of the internet. And so anyway, that's I think important in terms of human connections.
It's important, but it's an energy suck. Okay, every gadget you own gets updated every year, and it's progress. I really think we got to rethink our progress model here. Our progress model is bleeding us dry. And it's not the military that's doing it per se. Yes, it's what we're doing. So it's not so much that I own a Civic versus a Prius. It's the fact that I don't have all these things, but I could have an iPod or 2 computers, et cetera, et cetera. And they are, every time you get a new gadget that gets better and better, bigger screen, blah, 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 it takes more energy. And guess what? It plugs into your socket and it uses coal. Okay, so this is what I always say, get off your, We get off our high horses. Okay? Next time we knock coal, lose your lights 8 hours a day. So let's just be really honest about this. And how do you get out of that? There's not a silver bullet. It was nice to go from whale oil to X to Y. You know, we had those obvious things out there. There's not an obvious fix. And the problem is, it's probably 15 different things. And here's the role of government. Government can create a regulatory environment which promotes, incentivizes investment and things like that. But we're having a fundamental debate about the role of government. And what we've got is a quagmire doing nothing. So how do you have progress when you have no movement? The answer to the draft is yes. The other answer is recognize that war as a tool of foreign policy is one option. It might be effective in narrow instances. It doesn't solve everything. We have grown up, I grew up in an era when it was successful, and we believe that. And I think what we've seen are the limitations of it, partly because conflicts are different. But it doesn't fix everything. It creates a different set of problems. This might solve one thing, and then there's spin-offs. So I think we need to kind of open up our toolkit again, get creative. And I think we're capable of being creative.
Another question, please. Yes.
Professor Garrison brought up an opinion poll about the Americans not being confident in the American ability to interact positively with in the foreign realm. Is our confidence level related to our ability to watch the world as a whole now with the internet, with our information age?
I'm not really sure what...
I thought our confidence level...
I know, it's the orange one and the blue one.
And the blue one, right?
And
10 years, 10 years.
Yeah, and it's more about how much you want to be involved. Do you believe that we can accomplish what we want to accomplish in the world? And the numbers are down. That's the one.
We don't, as Americans, do not believe that we can accomplish positive things in the foreign realm. In the foreign.
Right. Well, I think part of it is a sense of tiredness with being involved. And some of the war has a certain amount of, what's the term? Fatigue. Yeah. Fatigue, yeah. Okay, so there's some fatigue going on. And then there's also a recognition that interdependence and a leveling of the playing field in certain areas and the rise of others has made it so you can't dictate as much. And so I think, so what's the role of the internet? Well, I mean, we know who created the internet. I mean, we know why the internet was created. It was created so that in the context of a nuclear war, you would have a secure communication set up with the U.S. military and other important entities. So it's really, there's an illustration of how you move forward. Government did that. And so, interesting spin-off. I think there's a fatigue factor, recognition that the world is complex, and maybe not just fatigue factor with ourselves, but just the plethora of issues to deal with. And the kind of the sense of where do you start? And we thought if we promoted democracy and we did aid projects and various things, we thought it would work. And it doesn't work as well as we think or anticipate.
Another question. Stan.
You know, it occurred to me when we went through the course of these various talks and then ending up with Peter and then harking back to the presidency. Somewhere Shakespeare said the play is the thing. So much of what we see on the world stage and in our domestic politics is really an acting out. I mean, it's probably no coincidence that Reagan was so popular and Schwarzenegger for a while and Al Franken and other show business personalities who have entered the political world. And, you know, it's really the play and acting out politics in Prince Hal, and on the other side, politicians who are really the best actors, particularly in today's age of this mass media, the ones who seem to do best are those who play the best role, rather than always having the best sense of leadership and knowledge.
Yeah, there's a great book that I just read about the country of Tanzania called Performing the Nation. And of course, in my case, it's all about music and dance. But it really is about performance theory, which is a very important part of anthropology, where we even perform gender, things that we take as common sense. But common sense is pretty negotiable sometimes. What's common sense to me may not be common sense to any of you, and so we perform, and the more that we can get this performance to sort of coincide. And I think, like you say, Stan, a leader is able to have a performance that people adhere to and go with. So
it's interesting. If I think about the Shakespeare play I was looking at today, or others of his plays, he's somebody who gives you a pretty naked look at the nastiness of political performance. Right there's scenes in the plays where there'll be two armies negotiating with each other, and one general will say to the other, if you dismiss your army, we're going to forgive this uprising. The army gets dismissed, and the opposing general then gets executed. Right? It was a performance. It was very politically effective, but it's bone-chilling in the sense of a loss of humanity that goes along with this effective political performance. But it seems underlying your question is a sense that performance speaks to inauthenticity, that if you're performing a role, you're somehow necessarily not genuine, or not truly interested in the common welfare or the country that you're supposed to be governing. And I think that often is the case, but then it's helpful to try to think too about the positive potential of performance. And here I would look at, Rod, what the folk culture that you're talking about. Would you talk about that as, is there a way to talk about that as a kind of an authentic expression of what a community is, or who a people might be? I know the idea of authenticity is really tricky to get your hands around, but it just seems like that might be an antidote to thinking about performance as always something that's corrupt, always something that's bankrupt, and always something that's duplicitous. That performance can actually be something that's productive in a good way.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I actually heard Stan's question a little bit differently, in that things are always changing. And that's the problem with, as Peter said, words like folk or tradition. That's a traditional thing. This is the way we do it, But it always changes, and I think that's what's so powerful about a strong performance, is that, in some ways you're performing change, a new thing, but you're drawing on old things to sort of, pull things together, like the Moldovan pop band that used those images of village instruments and village, tools and so forth, along with their electronic instruments and so forth. But I think that's one of the things I've enjoyed most about concepts about habitus and agency that anthropologists think about, is that things are always changing, and we can draw on these images of tradition, but someone who is able to, so to speak, give a performance and lead a group of people into a new way of thinking, I think that's a really powerful tool, and maybe that's one reason why.
Performance has a sense of audience response. Leadership does not exist without followership. So you have good leadership and good followership, and you can have that, and you can have the Nazi experiment. You can have that kind of, and so bystandership is a form of followership. So kind of when we think about these kind of host of issues out there, then in that sense, then, and particularly in a democratic system, there's this collective responsibility. that goes with a leadership. Now, I would agree. Frankly, I think Shakespeare is a fantastic window into discussing kind of difficult concepts and difficult things, because it really is timeless. And I think I'm going to take your class now. As somebody I'm sitting next to said, well, you could go take it, and I think maybe I should, because it would be more fun. I didn't have Shakespeare taught to me that way at UW 20 years ago. So I would just say that there's it's a complex interrelationship. It's a symbiotic relationship, and so I don't see all performance as negative. But the only way you can really judge a performance is to be informed. And so the internet, frankly, my concern about the internet, I understand everything Rod said about the internet, but the internet requires an editor, or you to be your own editor. And when you're kind of, if you're a blank slate, which I know we're not a blank slates in this room, but you have to judge what you're getting. And you're getting a lot. And one way to hide something is to get bombarded. Too much information is just as bad as too little. And so the loss of the newspaper, the loss of good journalism, kind of solid journalism, I guess I would say, is destructive to a society that requires open information flow so that you can judge what's going on. Let's remember that what Plato said about democracy. We assume it just exists. Well, it's fragile.
Well, it's worth saying, just piggybacking on what Jean just said, one of the things that we do as part of our academic disciplines at the university now is spend a lot of time with incoming students teaching them how to be critical about materials that they find on the internet. And I don't want to say that there's no critical discernment in the student body that we have at UW or other student bodies across the nation. That wouldn't be true. But there are countless examples that just astonish me of what students will find on the internet and just assume is authoritative because somebody wrote it and posted it in cyberspace. And so I don't mean to pick on students. I think it's a question for all of us as a society is to figure out how to be truly and genuinely discerning as in the face of this bombardment, as you say, Jean, of information that we have on the internet, not all of which is going to steer us in good ways.
The BP oil spill is a good example. All the search terms that deal with, I will get this wrong, but BP bought up a bunch of search terms so that every time you search something in a certain way, clean up, et cetera, it's the BP stuff that pops up.
Yeah, and it's all about how BP is doing all these great things to
yes.
clean up the Gulf of Mexico.
And the flip side was bought up by the people who are suing BP. The problems with, I don't know what the search terms are. Disaster and all this. And so what do you have? And we all know that now that when you Google something, and when you have the top 6 that pop up on the first page, and it's actually hard to get to the next set, those are the ones that are paid for, are bought like that. So you're getting a framing of the way it is based on your search terms. Be very careful.
That's a great point.
You got to do this set to know this and this set to know that. You're getting one side here and you're getting the other side there because they're savvy about how the system works. That was actually brilliant. Yeah. But of course, then there was this was NPR, wasn't it? They kind of broke that story. I'm sure that's.
It's the same with news, depending on what channel you watch.
Well, I think there's I think our level, our spectrum of acceptable discussion on issues is list wide. In Europe, it's more like this. There's illusion of entertainment as news going back and forth, talking about things in a very non-constructive way. So, and what I see is we've always had a very narrow spectrum of acceptable discussion. During the McCarthy era, it shrank. It widened back out. Post 9/11, it shrank again. And now we think, it's just popped back. These things, I think we have a very low tolerance because we start labeling people in non-constructive ways. So, yeah, media is.
I also think we may have a little more naivete still about what a search is on the internet. I mean, if I go to Fox News or MSNBC News, I feel like I know that I'm making a particular choice about how the news is going to be presented to me. But I still think I maybe have some naivete too. I was surprised by the BP story that if I plug in a search on Google, I'm going to get a kind of a disinterested or neutral set of responses. Not the case, obviously.
Gigi, I think you were next.
How do you teach the students to be discerning then about what they get on the internet?
Well, it's an ongoing process, but you do, there's ways in which you can talk about, what are there internal citations, basic standards of professional presentation of a website, right? So that typically a reputable website is going to have certain kinds of characteristics, and one that you want to question more skeptically isn't going to have them. And that can be as simple as, is there coherent grammar, right, on this site, or is it put together in a sloppy way which suggests that there's not been oversight? But also, are there internal citations? Are there any kinds of authorities that are being cited that will ground the claims that are being made? Would you guys add anything to that?
Ask them to say, who is this guy?
Right.
Yeah.
Make them go the next layer down. The author, sure,
Yeah.
or the group.
Right. Is the author identified anywhere on the website, or is it hidden?
Yeah. But I say the same thing when people are using, UN as some people write a paper and it's all UN sources, or something. I say, let's think about, what are your sources and who are your sources? And I'll be really frank. I will sometimes say you can have 5 of these, or half can be internet, and I want to know what the group is. And if I see Wikipedia popping up, who wrote that Wikipedia article?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the internet that we also have to be careful with, it's not all devious, as some of our comments have been. There's a huge movement, particularly in the sort of educated realm, to put information on the internet, to make it available. That's an unadulterated good in some way. And so if you look at, the most obvious huge project is Google Books, where they're scanning lots and lots of books onto the internet, and you can go look at them, search them, you don't have to buy them, you don't have to go to the library, they're all there. But the ones that you can get at are all out of copyright, which means that they're old. And what that means is it's very easy in my field, for example, to figure out what the scholarship was on the New Testament a century ago. It's much harder to figure out what the scholarship is today. And so what's easy isn't, even just because it's there, isn't always right. Yes?
I wanted to ask, aside from just the internet and aside from just your students, but including those, how do we cultivate a society all around from the beginning that has discernment? How do we cultivate discernment in the population from the beginning? How do we develop critical thinking and discernment in everything that's taken in? It just strikes me that the prevalent mentality that I find myself surrounded with is just utterly lacking in the slightest concept of how to do like what you just said when you get something on the internet. But never mind the internet, just what they hear. I mean, I think that's a huge, that dominates our country, It's like how do we change that from birth so that most people have a clue how to critically consider whatever they're getting from their teachers or parents or friends.
It's a great question. I'm facing this, teaching a class for the next 3 weeks to a group of professional music educators who are doing master's degrees in music education, and I've chosen a book for them to read that's very theoretical. And I don't know, maybe you guys will think I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I've decided I'll have them write a series of discussion papers, 2 pages only, and I make them cite ideas. But I think I'm going to limit them to the book and not let them go on the internet. And hopefully, I mean, it's a tiny, tiny step, but I'm hoping that they will enjoy having to think through ideas just from that one source, because I know the tendency is to sort of glance over the source and then go to all, like you said, all these, all this bombardment of information that we have. And I'm going to try, and I'll let you know if you want later on how it works out. I'm going to try to get them to really deal with the concepts in this one book, which I think is quite good. And, not that I'm trying to limit their thinking, but I'm trying to, like you said, make them think critically. And sometimes a little bit more focused information may be helpful for that. That's my idea anyway. I don't know. I don't always do that, but in this case, I'll know maybe a week from now, if it's working. It's hard because I work a lot with the Nepalese students on campus, and one of them, he was great. He actually, I ran through the union to grab my 5-minute lunch, and he was sitting there and he said, no, you have to sit and talk to me. And it was really hard. I kept thinking of all the things I was supposed to be doing. And he said to me, he's a doctoral student in education, and he's doing a project on teaching mathematics. And he said he's actually in Nepal now doing his first set of interviews. And I said, well, why do you want to do the interviews in Nepal? And he said, because people will take time to talk to me. And in the US, they won't. And he said, I'm going to practice on my friends in Nepal and these math teachers that he's found. And then he said, next year, I'll try to get some Americans to talk to me. But I don't know. I don't have very good answers to your question, but I'm thinking that it's just trying to have more time and make myself sit in one place and think through ideas.
Make them uncomfortable. That's what you do. Make them sit in somebody else's space. Now you can do various role-playing things. You can do some of these are simplistic exercises like debates of some sort, and they say, I want to do this, you make them do the other. So just so they have to think, and actually this is the reason I do this, and in international studies there's a capstone course. It's supposed to be the culminating experience. They write a big paper, research paper, which I grade in various stages, and it's read, all the way through, and they get tired of being told, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense. And so it's always asking how and why. So when somebody says something, I will say, why do you say that? Because they will assume something is, we all do this, don't we? We say such and such, I say it with firmness, and I have a little bit of authority, and some people will take what I'm saying as accurate. Well, sometimes it's not, inadvertently at least, and hopefully not deliberately. But the point is that it's what are your assumptions? What are your underlying assumptions for saying that? So I guess in the terms of an anthropologist, you deconstruct it a little bit. But that's part of the dialogue. There are very few facts. There are interpretations of reality. And I recognize that we can say that this is a glass and various things like that. But when you deal with the political space, there's just, I can say something and think it's carte blanche the way it is, and somebody else won't see it that way, and that's culture and other things for you.
One of the things that I've noticed in my Old Testament course is I have a good mix of students. Some of them come from backgrounds with no understanding, have never read the Old Testament, never looked at it before. Others come from backgrounds of believing churches or believing forms of Judaism, and they're intimately familiar with the text and they know it. And as well as, sort of reading the obvious things, I make them read the difficult passages. So for example, I make them read Proverbs 8. And in Proverbs 8, you have a woman who is created by God at the beginning, who is called Wisdom. And it's a poem about how wisdom dances with God and plays before him and helps him in creation. Everything is created through this woman, Wisdom. Now, whose wisdom? Who is wisdom? And you the first, all my Christian students want to say, oh, well, it's Jesus. Well, wait a minute. It's female. It's a creation. Are you a heretic telling me that Jesus is a creation and is not God? You know, so my point is, they want to bring an interpretation that they have learned to the facts of the passage. And what they will remember is the interpretation, not the passage itself. So when I go to examine, have a question on the test, half of them will get it wrong. Not because it's a hard question or we didn't spend enough time, but because they remembered the interpretation that they were taught in school or Sunday school rather than what the actual information was itself. And that's really our challenge, is we always remember the interpretations, the results, rather than the data, the facts that led us to that. And then we operate on the basis of the interpretations as if it was fact. And then we suddenly run up into a new situation where, oh, wait a minute, that interpretation doesn't hold anymore, or it's incorrect, and people react to it as if you're challenging the facts rather than you're challenging their interpretation of the facts. And it's an education process. And it does happen in schools. I mean, I've got a 12-year-old, and they've been doing a little bit of that at their, as students grow and their mind matures.
Is that kind of standard of specifically, standard of discerning or critically identifying information that you're looking at? Is that written into our curriculum from kindergarten? That there's a defined focus, that this is kind of, that this occurs at some appropriate level for that age? And I guess that's kind of what I wonder. It's like, has it been identified? We've got, let's say, like basic math and grammar and writing, but that, which would apply to all the topics.
I mean, how I wanted to answer your question, your original question, is really in terms of thinking about how we imagine education. It seems to me that all the answers that my colleagues gave to how do we create a society where people are more critically reflective and thoughtful, they all show our faith in education as a tool. So it's important, just on a really basic level, for a society to say we want to invest in education, because that is how we, for better or for worse, socialize a people into ways of living and into ways of building a better, more healthy, functional, just society. But it's not enough to just say we want to invest in education, but I think we also have to commit that education needs to be understood, at least in part, as a big process of questioning, and in which the questions don't have easy answers. That we have to allow ourselves to defer easy answers and to, one of the phrases that we use when we teach freshman composition is we ask our students to wallow in complexity. And I don't know, pigs wallow, and so I'm not sure that the language works all that well, but the sentiment is one in which you understand that part of what education is asking hard questions and getting people to realize that that's part of the responsibility and part of the pleasure, too, of becoming an educated person, is to keep questions open and be receptive to different ways of looking at the world and thinking about what possible answers might be.
And let me just pull this together on an up note, which is that I was at a presentation by a local legislator recently, and he was trying to explain the Wyoming budget to me and several other people in the room. And one point he made was that Wyoming spends more money on education than on anything else. So as a state, we really do value that, and we really do put our money where our mouth is. And I'm very pleased to be here. I saw a question right here.
It's more of a caution rather than a question, and it leads right from what you've been saying. But we cannot allow legislators to reduce education to merely performing well on tests, and to gauge every teacher by how the children perform on some type of test. Because that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with human beings who we want to have very broad knowledge, not just limited knowledge, and allow that time that can happen at first grade level or 8th grade level, and we're not going to limit it just to college level. as you were all involved with, where the exciting things happen, and the exciting things should happen in kindergarten. They're great, fifth grade.
Or else a lot of kids will never make it to the college level.
And also not to think that a teacher who only makes $30,000 is going to be a really exemplary kind of a teacher.
Can we rethink to value a lot of things, though? Not everybody should go to college.
No.
Not everybody is interested or suited. I think when I am trying to inculcate somebody or kind of get them enthused about what I do, and I recognize that there's a lot of people, particularly in the intro classes, that, well, they're not going to like what I do and what I like, and maybe they're not particularly good at what I do, but they're good at something else. So let's remember that there are other things, and there are other models of education, which include, let's value the people who do a lot of things for us, which are not terribly exciting, including putting this glass on this table today. And so I really think we need to really, so maybe the Chinese answer is, you know, there's a balance here between we want everybody to think broadly, but there are roles. And so it's a very complex, so sometimes I end up having an answer in my head, which is a little bit different than what I'm supposed to say as an educator. You know, we have this sense that educating, broadening minds, and all of this is a good, and I actually believe that, but I think that at the same time what we're doing is we need to recognize that there's a lot of things out there that need to get done that aren't terribly exciting, and that we should value them appropriately.
Well, this goes back to what you said earlier about, even in politics, you have the ideal of your goals and what you really kind of ideally like the political system to be. Then you have the reality of what life in the world is like and what the global economy and what strategies have to be for all the reality.
I'm going to speak in favor of the sort of intellect that I find among young people. One of the problems I have in our music department, and one reason that I think music students sometimes become disillusioned, is that we have such a narrow canon that we teach. We teach Western European classical music. And we have this canon that we've developed. And I think one of the problems for our students is that they see through it. And I'm fascinated by the idea that you know, many of the people that I encounter in Europe have not gone to college, and they are really intelligent, and they have, you know, they think critically, and they talk about important things, and they talk about music, and they weren't things that they learned on tests, or, you know, I was never a very good test taker. Unfortunately, I'm still not. But I do like to think about things a lot, and so it's a complicated question, and I have this thing where I park. I refuse to pay for parking on campus. That's a different issue. So I park out by the boondocks and ride my bike in, and I ride past. They've had this huge project to build these skyboxes on the stadium, which will be nice when they're done. But it's been going on for a long time. And I ride by there every day, and the guys that work there, and gals, are so interesting. You know, they'll say, hey, how's it going? And I look at that thing and I think, man, how are they doing this? And it's so interesting, and I'm sure they look at me and they go, wow, I'm sure glad I don't have to go to his office, you know? And so I think that's an important thing, is to say that not everybody has to go to college, and not everybody has to become a college professor, and there's so many interesting things to do in life, you know, and I don't know, I get excited about it. I sometimes just want to stop and talk to them, you know, these guys and gals that are working on this construction site.
I couldn't wait to get out of Wyoming. I got a degree in political science. I was an international studies major at UW, and I got out of Wyoming, and I went to the East Coast and got a PhD, and then I lived in Boston. And what convinced me to come back to Laramie wasn't the wind and the cold. No, actually, I really enjoyed the bluntness of Bostonians, and it was anyway, I won't go there. But I was struck by, and what I like about being from Wyoming and being in Laramie is I have a lot of connections to people in Laramie who are not university. I love my colleagues, and these are the colleagues who connect with the town. When I was a student in Laramie, I didn't connect to the town. I lived at the University of Wyoming. But it was the intellectual conversations that I had with my friends of friends when I came back to visit, who, well, this happened to be contractors and various things like that. And that's what convinced me that, oh, this is cool. I had better discussions in that group than I did, with, inside 495 around Boston. And it was an accessible discussion. And I will say that is why Saturday University is good, and why I'll plug International Studies. We do a speaker series around the state. One of the reasons I do it is I was the kid in that high school who was interested in those things. It didn't necessarily have too many people around me, or didn't know that they were there. Events like this bring it out. It brings people out of the woodwork, brings the worms out of the wood, right? And you can have these discussions. And that's really why I came back. I decided Laramie was okay. It took a couple of visits.
We could do one last question, and then I think we're out of time. Is there one?
Or answer.
I have one if no one else does.
I just wanted to say that I think if I had to identify a common theme, which was the question that you led off with, I would say that it would be leadership, the limitations of leadership, and the things that you have to sacrifice to be a leader, and also that on that stage we have global connectedness, and that's a new thing, and I think it's a struggle to figure out with the cultural anthropology how that needs to come together, and to take it down to more locally interesting article in the paper about Cynthia Lummis and the intellectual Easterner from Jackson Hole who is challenging her. And that leads back to your comment, but I just wanted to answer the original question, in my opinion.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you. If you have not left us your address or email and would like to be informed about next year's terms of Saturday University, please leave it on the table outside the door, and we will let you know as soon as we've got everything scheduled. Thank you.